All right, welcome to the second half. I just did half of this talk and it wasn't live. So I got to go back and redo everything I just did. And it wasn't live because the frickin' stream key changed and I didn't notice it. So let's rewind because I just did 60 pages of stuff and none of it was recorded. But we're recording now. So we rewind and we talk about the fact that basically Terence is giving us a recounting of ancient civilizations and their view of drugs and gender, and he gives a Luciferian interpretation of Genesis. In fact, he says that the serpent was basically trying to enlighten us, and if we'd only listen to that freaking serpent and not to the jealous Jehovah, which is again the Gnostic Luciferian doctrine. Terence believes that shrooms are the missing Darwinian link because they are the magical sacrament, the shamanic sacrament by which we developed supposedly our consciousness. Yes, you heard me right. And in fact, he goes to a trinity of sorts amongst shamanic traditions. He thinks that the shamanic tradition itself has its own inversion of a trinity. He says that there is Gaia, Moloch, and the shroom, and that these all together form the shamanic trinity. Nature worship, he says, was perfect on pages 88 and 89. And instead, we got this dominant, patriarchal, male Jehovah Christian society that has trampled upon our loving, noble savage running around in the woods naked and having orgies society. He says, in fact, this is the killer part, that there were a group of Indo-Europeans who at one time, he calls them the Kurgan waves. The Kurgan, where have we heard the Kurgan? Oh, that's the crazy guy we just had this debate with. I wonder if he chose that name not just because of the Highlander, but also because the Kurgans worshipped Katal Huyuk. And who is Katal Huyuk? Katal Huyuk is a bull god, Moloch. And Terence, very handily for us, identifies Moloch with Katal Huyuk on page 89. So now we know we're literally worshiping an inverted satanic trinity. He goes on to say that the evil inquisitions of Christianity set up these tribunals and courts which patriarchally dominated and enforced the bans on tripping balls on the witches. The good witches were trying to just show us the secrets of nature, show us the veggie logos, the logos of vegetables found within spirit, the spirits found within matter, within nature. And the evil dominators suppressed the good little witches. And so he goes on to tell us that the New World Order, he says, will be a tribal New World Order of a bunch of different little split up tribes in one giant global federation. He cites Marshall McLuhan for this, and he says that this syncretism will be the religion of the future. It is the Luciferian New World Order, New Age religion. And he says that it will be on the basis of a archaic revival. This is Terence's term. Terence is the one who kind of pioneers this idea of returning to the shamanic traditions, returning to living in unison with, quote, nature, being a good little pagan. And this will be connected to things like austerity. You'll have your coffin apartment because you're plant-based, mate. You're a plant. You're just a little plant. Because everybody's a plant. You're a plant-based soy boy. As a cell on the skin of Gaia. He cites William Blake as a figure who was prophetic for this new coming age. And of course, William Blake always comes up in the Luciferians because he was a Luciferian Gnostic. And Terence gives us on page 94 a powerful predictive phrase that I don't even know if he knew how famous this phrase would be, which is to go green. In 1992, Terence was predicting going green, the corporate agenda of green austerity predicted by Terence back in 1992. He says, go green or die. And what does it mean to go green? Does that just mean your diet? Does that just mean recycling? Oh, no. This means adopting a plant-based worldview. you see. It's a whole new paradigm where you're just a plant growing on the surface of Mother Gaia, right? You're a cell. You're like a hair on my arm growing on the surface of Mother Gaia. And if you don't do good, you don't submit to your soy masters, you get plucked out like the nose hairs I pluck out in the morning. You're plucked out of me because I'm Gaia. Gaia is a holistic organism, and now you are just a cell in Gaia. So therefore, becoming plant-based does not just mean being healthy, being integrated into a collective. It actually means plant worship, and that's what we're going to see as Terence progresses into the second half of the book. The plant worship that he's discussing is actually the cult of Soma, he thinks, right? So there's this ancient Vedic tradition. What is the mystery plant? What is the esoteric mystery juice of the ancient Vedic texts that's mentioned? Soma, what is it? Well, we don't know. It's some kind of sweet liquid that gave you all sorts of powers, happiness, tranquility, blah, blah, blah. Known in the religions, in the regions of Iran, for example, as Homa, Soma, Hyoma. Some sort of juice of the gods. And in fact, the way it's described in the Vedic text actually sounds like what is in Dune. If you've seen my Dune analyses or read them, you know that you know about the Mentat, that they have a religion where they cite this poem by the juice of Safu, the thoughts acquire speed, the lips acquire stain, the same become warning, is by will and alone I set my mind in motion. It's literally, I never knew this, but now I can see, obviously, Frank Herbert is lifting this from the Vedic text because the juice of Safu is referring to the Soma. And that's literally how the Soma trips speak of it. The thoughts acquire stain, or the lips, thoughts acquire speed, right? You're enlightened. He then goes on to talk about Gordon Wasson and Gordon Wasson's important place in as an agent of J.P. Morgan and the CIA, going and extracting the necessary shrooms down in Mexico, Oaxacan, Mexico, and Mazateca, Sierra Mazateca. And then taking these back in 1957 to Albert Hoffman at the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation. And then in 1971, Wasson writes Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. And then hence gives us the whole CIA counterculture. Now, Terence is a establishment figure. You could compare him to somebody like Noam Chomsky as a gatekeeper. So Terence supports the narrative that the CIA, they didn't want everybody taking LSD. No. They want everybody drinking alcohol and eating chocolate. That's what he says. But not taking shrooms and LSD. Oh, really? Really? Is that right? No, we know better now because we know about Dave McGowan. We know the whole 60s counterculture was a bunch of BS. Tim Leary himself says you can thank the CIA for the whole 60s counterculture. And so then what Terence goes on to do is discuss the theories of Gordon Wasson on what Soma was. And Gordon Wasson seemed to think that the Soma wasn't a shroom. So he proposed it and then changed his mind. He doubts it. But again, keep in mind that this is the same Gordon Wasson who's an agent of the bankers and the CIA. The ancient shrooms were a sacrament. He discusses the ancient Greek Minoan, Dionysian cults, Demeter, Diana, all these different possibilities of where we could have gotten, or where under which religious mystery religion cult the secrets of Soma might be hidden. And again, we know with Terence, it is the shroom. The shroom is the great ancient sacrament. But I wanted to point out that on page 137, in the Twilight in Eden section, he talks about words being problematic and that perhaps we could move past words because words are ego dominant, that we could just have some kind of like mind meld through iconographic images and thoughts. And so he actually proposes a pro-polytheism perspective, and that the polytheism of the ancient world was much better than the monotheism of Christianity. He goes on to discuss the usage of alcohol. Alcohol was a form of nostalgia for paradise, but is actually a replacement for whatever the original soma was. Alcohol, he says, is a patriarchal, oppressive drug, and it was perhaps given to us by the evil Vikings, and mead is evil, and so it is not the original soma, but some kind of patriarchal replacement for soma. He then goes on to discuss attempts at finding the philosopher's stone through alcohol in The Alchemist, alchemy. And then he mentions alchemist Raymond Lull. We know who Raymond Lull is, the blessed amongst the Roman Catholic theologians and philosophers, known for his many writings on esotericism, on the virtues, and on philosopher's stone. Alchemy. Alchemy goes back to ancient Egypt and the Greeks as the attempt to find immortality, ultimately, right? That's what it means to transmute base metals into gold. Then he discusses cannabis. Cannabis has a long history of also being connected to the world of the mystical, the world of metaphysics. Alcohol, he says, does have a spiritual dimension. However, the spirits of alcohol are spiritual. And the same is true with THC, marijuana, and hashish. We know about the Muslim assassins who were addicted to hashish. Everybody knows about that. He thinks that marijuana's popularity could be as a result of being a substitute for whatever the original soma was, right? So we don't know what soma was, but perhaps marijuana is one of the substitutes for it. He says that marijuana is good for storytelling, the arts, and creativity. But in the 1930s, it was demonized at the behest of the power of giant petroleum corporations and William Randolph Hearst. And so it was called the weed of death. And they didn't want to compete with hemp. And so marijuana was demonized, and prior to the 1930s, it was not. And so this, he says, where he's accurate here, whatever your view of THC and marijuana is, he says that in the future, the THC will be a powerful component, marijuana will be a powerful component of the promotion of the archaic revival. Again, remember that the archaic revival, which is one of Terence's terms, is the social engineering idea, the tool, one of the means to move society away from the kind of capitalist, individual, Western, whatever when you want to call it, society that it presently has, into a return to the primitive. Somehow the primitive is given a better ontological status. It's more spiritual. It's what we want to get back to, right? The archaic revival, primalism, basically. But what does he mean by that? Does he mean actually healthy things? Well, in some places he means healthy things. For example, he's against TV watching, which is healthy, but he also means being plant-based and laying around and just having orgies all day. So no, that's not healthy for you. He argues that marijuana is better than alcohol in certain respects because it lowers the ego, supposedly. And then he goes on to talk about sugar, coffee, tea, chocolate, and that these cash crops were intimately tied to the history of the slave trade. So I'm not going to go too much into the history of the slave trade. I'm sure that you guys have heard of this. It goes back to the Arabs, the Arab world converting black Muslims, and then the black Muslims enslaved the other tribes, and this gave rise to the slave trade in connection with sugar, the cash crop of sugar, which then followed with these other cash crops, namely tea, coffee, cocoa, tobacco. These, he argues, are cash crops that are particularly useful to the empire. Imperium likes these cash crops because these cash crops are super addictive, and it shows that humans love drugs, right? We love drugs, and the empire has known that we love drugs, hence the usage of opium, the opium wars against China, right? Britain uses opium as a tool of social engineering, the same model of social engineering being used now in the U.S. with fentanyl and all these different super Oxycontin, super powerful Narcotics. Narcotics, he says, have a long history, obviously, going back to the mother goddess. Poppies are connected with Gaia. Poppies and opium are known as the destroyer of grief, the bringer of dreams, the bringer of death. And the great alchemist Paracelsus was apparently a big fan of opium. I didn't actually know that. I actually have read Paracelsus, I have his book. That might be a useful book to do an analysis on in the near future. One of his key texts. And then after Paracelsus, you had the character of Dr. von Helmont, who was a more or less Dr. Opiatus, he was called. He was so into opium. And we think of characters like Gary Oldman in Dracula, taking absinthe and tripping out, or Johnny Depp in From Hell, smoking opium or absinthe or whatever he was doing, and getting access to the spiritual realm, right, in pop culture. But when it comes to tobacco was actually rolled up into leaves, and you lit it on fire and you stick it in your nose, and it was super addictive. But what I never understood about this was apparently the Mayans have a strain of tobacco that's highly, highly addictive and hallucinogenic. I never knew that. So the commercial tobacco that we smoke is not like that, obviously. The Mayans were tripping balls on a different strain of tobacco. And in fact, the Indians had somehow invented some version of enemas with tobacco. And so blowing smoke up one's butt is quite literally what they did. They would literally blow smoke up butts to get a super trip. Not only that, they also blew smoke into vajayjays. They thought that could heal hysteria. Women's histrionics could be healed by blowing cigar smoke into the vajayjay. I don't know. I don't trust Terence McKenna to be accurate, but he claims that Pope Urban II excommunicated people who wanted to smoke tobacco. Supposedly, King James hated tobacco and thought that it was just the practice of savages. Yet, within the reign of King James himself, there was at one point 7,000 tobacconists in England. Terence moves on then to discuss synthetic drugs. The synthetic drugs that are most well known would be the beginning of synthetic versions of opium with morphine. This led to the phenomena of junkies, and as we said, that gave rise to the idea of the opium wars and how you could create, basically through drug addiction, masses of population that were worthless to their leaders, and therefore you have destroyed the whole society. Drugs are a tool of elites against society. Duh. Junkies were detached. They were unable to defend themselves. They became addicted to highly addictive substances. And it's opium and morphine. These are perfect drugs for those who have undergone trauma, people in battlefields, people in pain, people about to die, right? Because it sort of allows you to escape. Moving on, cocaine was seen in South America as a food because it actually contains a lot of nutrient properties. It's not just a drug. She is associated with a goddess called Mama Coca. She is the inspiration for the Jekyll and Hyde character because of what cocaine does when it is ingested. It makes a person happy and want to dance. I did cocaine one time, and that's exactly what it does. It makes you happy and you want to dance. So it's the perfect drug for going out to the dance club. And it lasts like 3 espressos, and it's about 45 minutes, and then you have the worst headache ever, in my case. So let's see. Cocaine was at the same time as marijuana said to be the drug of choice of crazed black people, and that the crazed black people would go and kill anybody if they got a hold of cocaine. So he then launches into a discussion of the connection between drugs and intelligence agencies, which is interesting because Terence is correct here. Terence is actually right that intelligence agencies utilize drug funding to fund black ops through black market funds, which cannot be traced and tracked. So that's why it's very useful. And he mentions the examples of the CIA, Opus Dei, and French intelligence secret service uniting to take over different drug lanes in the world. Yes, exactly. We've talked about that many times in many talks our globalism book talks and others as well. For example, the OSS and the Office of Naval Intelligence united with the Sicilian Mafia and the Green Gang of Shanghai, which I'm assuming are triads, from the time of World War I up into World War II. This market was being run by the OSS and the ONI. So gangsters, loan sharks, rackets, alcohol, prostitutes, all tie into the same world. Now, this is the next area, is the place that we will give Terence a little bit of props. This is really one of the only things he gets right, which is that television is an electronic drug, more addictive, more pleasurable, and more useful to the establishment than the rest of the drugs. So they found out that TV was highly addictive, that TV is a easy way to atomize society, which I appreciated Terence realizing that. It leads to social engineering. It's one of the most powerful tools for social engineering. And in fact, the LSD experiments of MK Ultra, what they actually showed was that rather than focusing on tripping balls and LSD, the best way to control society was through TV. TV was way more useful for social engineering than LSD. TV taught everyone to love Big Brother, and you can just see that with the boomers. The entire boomer generation loves the government, and they believe that the government was there to help them, and that the wars are being fought for all of those noble reasons, and not at the behest of bankers and social engineering scientific technocrats. Next, Terence launches into a discussion on psychedelics. He says that Gnostics is interesting. I don't know why it's interesting that he begins this section on the psychedelics by talking about the Gnostic. It's not surprising to me, but it's interesting that he goes there and is very open about his position. The Gnostics were the remnants of the ancient pagan beliefs. And so Christianity wanted to ban you from talking directly to Gaia. Yes, so you can talk to all these entities and spirits, even though we're not going to be superstitious. Remember that earlier on, right? Ayahuasca, he begins with, which is a interesting hallucinogen that is sound-driven, connected to a lot of music and songs. He says that one of the interesting features of hallucinogens is the experience of group mind and telepathy. I can confirm that this does occur. I've seen it happen. I've had friends that have done various hallucinogens and have experienced these experiences. So it's very real. It's a kind of magic, according to Terence. And then he moves on to discuss the rise of and creation of LSD in the 1960s. Well, it's actually before that with Wasson and Sandoz, and then into the 60s when it begins to be popular. And he talks about group rituals. That's very interesting because although Terence doesn't talk about it in the late 80s, early 90s, when Terence wrote this book, is when you have the phenomena of techno festivals, big global techno situations going on. Those are the resurgence of tribal group experiences, group rituals. And the LSD hardcore hallucinogen experience is useful because it breaks down boundaries and cultural conditioning. And then here we get Terence giving us the normie analysis of why would the CIA want us to have LSD? Well, they don't, and so actually it's everybody needs to be doing shrooms and LSD so that they could break free from the mind control of the establishment. Of course, the LSD and shroom experience is actually totally mind control and out of MK Ultra. So Terence is completely wrong, and we know this again from Dave McGowan and Tim Leary, right? LSD is in fact not counterculture. It is created counterculture and fostered by the CIA to re-engineer society. So you say, why would they ever want us to question them and go against society? Really? Do you think it's that simple? Do you think that there's as if they don't want to ever destabilize? Come on. How naive are you? He talks about in the 70s and 80s that there were these crypto anarchists who promoted LSD and that they really wanted to free us up. Man, as if the system doesn't use anarchists. Come on. He says during the 80s, the predominant drugs were cocaine and television. And he says cocaine was the drug of the rich man and television was the drug of the poor man. That's an interesting analysis. I never thought about that. I guess that's probably true, though, right? About the 80s. That's when TV just becomes just almost omniscient, right? All-encompassing. Everything's about TV shows, TV everywhere. Everything's TV. Richard Evans Schultz comes into the picture here because he is the OSS botanist. Yes. Shocker. Where does DMT come from? Oh, does it come to us outside of the intelligence agencies? No. Just like LSD and all the other drugs, DMT comes to us from the OSS. Richard Evans Schultz is an OSS botanist, right? And so the shamans had it all figured out through DMT. Goes to Harvard, gets Tim Leary doing this. Tim Leary hooks up with Schultz. They're talking and studying, and they do shrooms, and then they do the LSD, and then guess what? Tim Leary is this huge devotee of Aleister Crowley, and he's going to bring in the new Aeon, and you see how it's all connected. We're right here from Luciferianism, Gnosticism, Crowleyanism, Archaic Revival, Tim Leary, OSS, DMT botanist Richard Evans Schultz. And we can even connect that to pop culture. Katy Perry's dad was hooking up Tim Leary with LSD. Again, go check out Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. The archaic paradise is the archaic revival. We're going to go back to Eden because Eden was really shrooms and shaman and Luciferianism. Right? Once Gordon Wasson and the CIA had gathered their shrooms and created psilocybin and then created, through Sandow's LSD and all these other things, then we had the big DMT spill from Schultz and Terence. Terence says, we got to do this because it's the most powerful, right? DMT is the most powerful hallucinogens. And Aldous Huxley says, anytime you have a trip, it is a special grace. We've talked about this before. Aldous Huxley refers to the hallucinogen experiences like they're sacraments. That's what this whole book is about. In fact, this is interesting because I never knew that this was Terence's view until I read Terence. But I said long ago, watch one of my first YouTube videos 10 years ago where I talked about them being satanic sacraments. And that's essentially what these guys say. This whole book, Food of the Gods, Sacrament of the Gods, Sacrament of the demons. That's what he's saying. Terence says the solution is to make these sacraments available to everybody by legalizing it and taxing it. Now, whatever you think of Terence, he's actually telling you what's coming. That is where we are now. And it's only a matter of time before the rest of these drugs are legalized and taxed because they are tremendous tools for socially engineering all these dupes and dum-dums in the internet sphere. Think of the Joe Rogan crowd, all of whom think that doing DMT is giving them special enlightenment, and they're nothing but completely controlled morons. Terence says that set and setting are very important when you prepare your trips. He tells you what to do to prepare for your DMT and acid trips. He talks about doing it the shamanic way of going, trying to getting rid of exterior sensory influences, go in the dark and chill, relax, don't have any noises going, and get ready to do the shamanic journey into the psychosphere. And when you get into the psychosphere, he quotes Plotinus. This is interesting. I didn't expect him to bring in Neoplatonism, but he says, like Plotinus, we can have the flight of the alone back to the alone. Of course, we've covered the Aeneads of Plotinus. Go listen to the Aeneads talk if you want more on that. But here we have Terence bringing this in, and Terence says that we got to get rid of these fundy Christians because it's the fundy evil Christians that are keeping you back from having fun. If it wasn't for those dang fundy Christians, you could be tripping balls and having orgies. Yeah, the establishment, they sure don't want you tripping balls and having orgies, even though that's all that they promote all the time. Yeah, so that alone right there shows you Terence is a gatekeeper. Be alone and shamanically trip, he says, and you will find the Hellenistic logos in your acid trip on page 2. What? So here we see a clear example of the fact that the word logos is determined by its context. And so therefore E. Michael Jones is wrong. You can't just say we want to unite with the Hellenistic logos, because here the Hellenistic logos is Lucifer. The archaic revival is useful for social engineering because it will allow them to bring us back to austerity, the banker's austerity, and you will be placed into your coffin apartment living your plant-based lifestyle. The plant-based lifestyle and veganism go together, and in fact, Terence supports this stuff. He's against eating red meat. He's pro-vegan. Shocker, huh? In this book. He promotes the lie that psychedelics are contrary to what the establishment wants. No, psychedelics are part of the establishment-created counterculture. It is an operation of the CIA and MKUltra and the deep state to promote these things. Terence says that when you look at a city or like Los Angeles or Silicon Valley, he says, we are all manipulated. We are a giant circuit board programmed by the computers and the electrical cords. So it's like a big motherboard. He says, and instead we're focused on this virtual motherboard and we need to get back to nature. Nature versus computer here. So there's a little bit of kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Unabomber guy. I mean, they're kind of a little bit of this kind of thing, but not really, right? Because that guy was part of MKUltra too, right? So, interestingly, he is correct when he says, once again, the war on drugs is actually run by the government who runs the drugs. Terence is correct on that. We'll give him some props for that statement. And then he goes on to say that the CIA will continue to run the drugs unless we legalize it and make it a point that it's your civil right to do shrooms and trip balls. Now, this is ironic because it's Tim Leary who said that if you really want to convince people to do drugs, tell them that it's their civil right and they're being kept from their civil right. He said that I had much more success selling people on doing drugs through that than by just telling them to do drugs. Humans love to do drugs, and they love coffee and tea and cocaine, and so therefore all drugs should be legal, and we should all just be doing drugs and having sex with whoever we want. Free love, right? He's continuing the tradition of the counterculture here. And DMT, he says, is the best way to get our answers on the spiritual vacuum that we have in the West. If we would just do DMT and legalize the drugs, we could find our spiritual roots by uniting with the clockwork elves and the Hellenistic logos. I kid you not. He goes on to discuss that shrooms are the missing link. That's what it means for him to be plant-based. Do shrooms. You'll find that that's the missing link. And then you will, I'm not kidding, you will contact the clockwork elves and you will learn their rituals. You will find out that they are the real aliens. They exist in the aeon, outside of time. And he says that they are the Gnostic entities. These are the children. And these entities, he says, are like gods who gift their children humans with all kinds of sweet, sweet things. The entity that we think is God, Terence says, is actually a lost continent in the human mind. And instead, what we need to do is turn away from the church to the clockwork elves, who are the spirits and demons of folklore. Yes, they're the spirits and the demons. If we turn to them and contact them, they will lead us to the overmind. Where have you heard of the overmind before? Oh, that's the Luciferian generic god of Arthur C. Clarke. Remember Childhood's End? Terence is talking just like Luciferian Arthur C. Clarke because they're Luciferians. They all have the same view. He says the clockwork elves and the overmind regulate the cultural changes. They are the mind of our planet. Oh, it's not the divine. It's not God's mind. It's a impersonal mind, which makes no sense. Right? This is Luciferian Platonism. These alchemical spirits help the great work. Oh, what is this great work? It's what Carl Jung talked about with alchemy and Gnosticism. So there you go. What's the salvation of Western society and of the world? Become plant-based, do shrooms, go through a ritual initiation. This is exactly what Rudolf Copper said the archaic revival would come and that we would all go through a mass initiation. This would lead us to interacting with the elves, who are demons, who are aliens, and that they would lead us to understand that we need to be part of the great work, which is the alchemical transhumanist apotheosis. So there you go. Terence McKenna is a complete lunatic and a complete Luciferian. There is absolutely no question about it. He does discuss MK Ultra. There are little nuggets and bits of truth here, but really the essence of why this book is useful is that the way out, he says, the salvation of society is to become plant-based. Does that mean veganism? It partly does mean veganism and going green and living in tiny coffins in mega cities. It actually means doing shrooms, because shrooms are the missing link, the Bigfoot missing link to prove Darwinism, to prove how we got our consciousness through evolution and blind process, the way that we contact the Gnostic deity, not the biblical God, the other one. Oh, that's the Luciferian entity, right? Moloch, he says. Yes, Moloch. So there we go. The clockwork elves will save us. And let's remember, let's go back to the beginning. What was the beginning of the book? The first chapter? The first chapter told us everything, remember? The first chapter told us how we are evolving to a new world order, a global culture. The internet will be an example of how this is going to be a global culture. We will return to the worship of the goddess, and the goddess will bring democracy in a new world order. This will lead people to demand existential experiences of the divine. We will give them that through the sacrament of shrooms and drugs, and this will be a ritual initiation into shamanistic Gaia worship, which will lead to zero population growth. And it is the war, he says, against Christianity. Wow. Wow. So, in essence, turn away from Christianity, join the New World Order, worship the clockwork elves, and let them possess you so that you can see Lucifer. Literally. Through his Luciferian sacraments. All right. That is everything that we expected, and way more clear. Way more crystal clear than I could have ever imagined Terence would actually be. I thought Terence would be a lot more subtle, a lot more vague, maybe give us some hints here and there. No. He just lays it all out, even in the first chapter. And it only goes from that to amazingly more Luciferian by the end of the book. So there you have it. Thank you for this talk. The next talk in the Globalism Books talk will be the next live stream that we do, which will be God the Invisible King. It will fit actually well with this. Even though God the Invisible King was written by H.G. Wells 100 years before, roughly, now, 80 or 90 years before Terence McKenna, 102 years ago from 2019. And H.G. Wells is going to tell us about God, who he thinks God is, and what the religion of the New World Order would be. Thank you for watching. God bless. I hope you enjoyed this. And I apologize that this was a little bit late, but we had big debates coming and a lot of work to do in terms of moving. So I moved in now. I have my house ready. So hopefully we can just start cranking out the content, and hope you guys enjoyed it.